I'm Bonnie, 34 female. I live alone in a small but perfect for me 3-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. As a data analyst, my life is about finding patterns and making logical sense of chaos, which is probably why I value peace and order so much in my personal life. For the last 6 years, this house has been my sanctuary, the one place where everything was exactly as it should be. That all changed when my mom, Eline, moved in. Now, I'm about to serve an eviction notice to my own mother, who genuinely believes she's entitled to my home because she planted some prize-winning roses in the front yard. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The whole mess started, as most family disasters do, with a simple request wrapped in a thick layer of guilt. My father had passed away 2 years prior, and my mother, Eline, had been rattling around in their large, 4-bedroom family home ever since. She decided it was too much house for one person, a sentiment I fully supported. My brother Mark and I had both offered to help her downsize, find a nice condo, or even look into a retirement community that had a vibrant social scene she might enjoy. She waved away all our suggestions with an air of martyrdom. "I'm not ready to be put out to pasture," she'd say, even though we'd only suggested places with tennis courts and swimming pools. Her plan, which she announced over a tense Sunday dinner, was to sell the family home and then take some time to decide on her next move. The problem was the timing. A buyer had appeared out of nowhere, offering cash and a quick closing date, so quick, in fact, that she'd have to be out in 3 weeks. She hadn't even started looking for a new place. That's when all eyes turned to me. "Bonnie, darling," she began, her voice syrupy sweet, "you have that lovely spare room. It would only be for a month or 2, just until I find the perfect little cottage." I hesitated. My relationship with my mother has always been complex. She was a head librarian for 30 years before retiring, and she runs her life and everyone else's, if given the chance, with the same rigid Dewey Decimal System logic. Everything has a place, and every person has a role. My role, as the unmarried daughter with a spare room, was apparently to be her temporary landlord. Mark, my younger brother, shot me a look from across the table. It was a mix of sympathy and a silent plea for me not to give in. He knew what she was like to live with. We both did. But how could I say no? She was my recently widowed mother, about to be homeless. The guilt was a powerful motivator. "Of course, Mom," I heard myself say. "You can stay with me for a couple of months." She clapped her hands together, a picture of relieved delight. "Oh, thank you, sweetie. You won't even know I'm there." That was the first of many lies. She arrived not with a few suitcases, but with a moving van. Boxes labeled kitchen, linens, and most ominously, decor, were stacked in my garage. My minimalist living room was suddenly cluttered with her dark, heavy furniture that made the space feel 10 years older. She immediately started rearranging things. My cookbooks were shunted to a lower shelf to make way for her collection of porcelain thimbles. A framed print I loved was taken down and replaced with a dreary landscape painting she'd owned for decades. "Just making it feel a bit more homey, dear," she'd chirp when I'd find yet another of my belongings displaced. At first, I bit my tongue. I told myself it was temporary. She was grieving, she was stressed from the move, and she needed to feel comfortable. I set boundaries, of course. I explained that while she was welcome, this was my house and my rules still applied. We drew up a simple agreement, not a formal lease, but an email I sent her outlining the terms, which she verbally agreed to. No rent, but she would contribute a small amount for the increase in utilities. Her stay was not to exceed 3 months, by which point she was expected to have found her own place. She smiled, nodded, and said it was all perfectly reasonable. The first month was bearable, if a little strained. The real trouble began in the garden. My yard was my pride and joy. I'd spent years cultivating a low-maintenance garden filled with native grasses and wildflowers. It was natural, a little wild, and I loved it. Eline, however, saw it as a personal affront. "It looks so unkempt, Bonnie," she said one afternoon, wrinkling her nose. Before I knew it, she had declared war on my wildflowers. She ripped them out and replaced them with perfectly manicured rose bushes and rows of unnaturally vibrant petunias. She spent hundreds of dollars at the garden center, money I knew was from the sale of her house. When I confronted her, she was indignant. "I am improving your property, Bonnie. This will add thousands to your home's value. You should be thanking me." I tried to explain that I didn't care about the property value. I cared about my garden, the one I had designed and loved. She didn't listen. The garden became her territory. She was out there from dawn till dusk, digging, planting, and pruning. My neighbors, who had always complimented my natural-looking yard, now commented on my mother's lovely English garden. It felt like she was systematically erasing me from my own home, starting from the outside in. The 2-month mark came and went. Then the 3-month deadline passed. Every time I brought up her search for a new place, she had an excuse. The market was too expensive. The condos were all cheaply made. Nothing felt right. She was becoming more and more entrenched. Her mail was now being forwarded here permanently. She bought a new, enormous television for the living room without asking. My house was no longer my own. It was a shared space, and I was rapidly losing control. Mark called me every few days to check in. "How's it going?" he'd ask, his voice laced with concern. "She's settling in," I'd say, trying to sound cheerful. Settling in or digging in like a tick, he'd shoot back, he knew. The breaking point was still a few weeks away, but the foundations were being laid, just like the neat little brick borders she was installing around her precious flower beds. She wasn't just staying with me, she was taking over. The temporary favor had become an indefinite occupation, and I was starting to realize that getting her to leave was going to be a battle I was completely unprepared for. I had opened my home out of love and obligation, and in doing so, I had handed her the keys to my life. I just didn't realize she had no intention of ever giving them back. The transition from temporary guest to permanent resident in my mother's mind was both gradual and shockingly abrupt. It happened in small increments. A new armchair appearing in the den, her name being added to the local community newsletter. But the moment I knew things had truly gone off the rails was during a conversation about the roof. I'd had a contractor come by to give me an estimate for some minor repairs. He was a friendly, local guy who had done work for me before. My mother, of course, inserted herself into the conversation, peppering him with questions about shingle quality and insulation. After he left, she turned to me with a serious expression. "Bonnie, I really think we should go with the architectural shingles. They have a longer warranty, and while they cost more upfront, the long-term investment makes sense for us." The word hung in the air between us. Us. "Mom, what do you mean, us?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. "This is my house. I will be the one making the decision and paying for it." She waved her hand dismissively, as if I were a child fussing over something trivial. "Don't be silly. I'm living here now. It's my home, too. I'm happy to contribute to the cost. In fact, I insist. I'll pay for half of the roof repairs." I was floored. "You're not paying for my roof, Mom. You're supposed to be saving your money to buy your own place." Her expression hardened. The warm, maternal mask dropped, replaced by the stern librarian who tolerated no dissent. "And I will. But in the meantime, I have a vested interest in the upkeep of this property. I've put a lot of work into this place." She gestured grandly towards the front window, where her perfectly manicured garden was on full display. "That garden alone has significantly increased the curb appeal. I'm investing in my home." It was the second time she'd said it. My home! The first time could have been a slip of the tongue. The second was a declaration. My sanctuary was now, in her mind, a joint venture. The arguments became more frequent after that. She criticized my cleaning habits, my cooking, even the friends I had over. She would follow my guests to the door and offer unsolicited advice on their lives. It was mortifying. My home, once a place of calm retreat, was now a constant source of stress. I felt like a teenager again, living under my parents' roof, chafing under the weight of constant scrutiny. The most audacious claim came about 5 months into her stay. I sat her down and told her, in no uncertain terms, that this arrangement was no longer working. I had found several listings for lovely apartments nearby and offered to go with her to view them. "I don't understand why you're trying to kick me out, Bonnie," she said, her eyes welling up with tears. It was her go-to tactic, weaponized emotion. "I'm not kicking you out, Mom. I'm reminding you of our agreement. It was supposed to be for 3 months. It's been 5. I need my space back. I need my life back." She sniffled, pulling a handkerchief from her sleeve. "But I've made this my home. I've put so much of myself into it. The garden, my furniture, I have rights." I stared at her, bewildered. "What rights? You're a guest in my house, you don't pay rent." And that's when she dropped the bombshell. "I have established residency, and I have made significant financial contributions to the property." I must have looked completely blank because she elaborated. "The garden, Bonnie, all those plants, the soil, the fertilizer, the new sprinkler system I had installed, that's an investment. It's called sweat equity. I've improved this property. A judge would see that. A judge would understand that I can't just be thrown out on the street. I have a claim to this house now." I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. Was she serious? Did she actually believe that planting flowers gave her legal ownership of my property? It was the most entitled, delusional thing I had ever heard. I had bought this house with my own money, a down payment I had saved for 10 years. My name was on the deed. My name was on the mortgage. Her name was on nothing. "Mom, that's not how it works," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Planting flowers doesn't make you a homeowner. That's absurd." "It's not absurd," she snapped, her tears instantly drying up. "It's about what's fair. I sold my home, the home you grew up in, and I have nowhere else to go. You have more than enough space. A court will see that I've made this my home and that I've contributed to its value. They won't let you make your own mother homeless." The conversation ended there. She stormed off to her room, and I was left sitting in my living room, surrounded by her heavy, oppressive furniture, feeling like an intruder in my own life. Her logic was so twisted, so profoundly selfish, that I could barely wrap my head around it. She hadn't just overstayed her welcome. She was actively trying to stake a claim on my property, using her own manufactured kindness, the unwanted garden, as her legal leverage. I called Mark later that night, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. I relayed the conversation, a part of me hoping he'd laugh and say she was just being dramatic. But he was silent for a long moment after I finished. "Bonnie," he said finally, his voice grim, "she's not just being dramatic, she might actually believe it. You know how she gets. Once she decides something is true, it becomes fact in her mind. You need to be careful." He was right. This wasn't just a family squabble anymore. My mother had drawn a line in the sand, or rather, in the imported topsoil of my front yard. She was no longer a guest. In her mind, she was a co-owner, and she was daring me to challenge her. The gardener's claim, as ridiculous as it sounded, was her declaration of war. And I realized, with a sinking heart, that I was going to have to fight her to get my home back. The week following my mother's declaration was a living nightmare of passive aggression. She would hum cheerfully while tending to her investment in the garden, giving me pointed looks through the window. She started leaving pamphlets for legal aid services for seniors on the kitchen counter. It was a Cold War fought with thorny roses and strategically placed legal literature. I felt like I was losing my mind, trapped in a surreal sitcom where the laugh track had been replaced by the constant, unnerving snipping of pruning shears. My breaking point, and the moment I knew I couldn't handle this alone, came from an unexpected source. It was a Saturday afternoon, and our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gable, a sweet widow in her late 70s, called me over to the fence as I was taking out the recycling. "Bonnie, dear, your mother's garden is looking absolutely professional," she said, her smile genuine. "She has such a green thumb." "Thanks, Mrs. Gable," I replied, forcing a smile. "She certainly puts a lot of work into it." Her expression shifted slightly, a flicker of concern in her kind eyes. She lowered her voice, leaning closer over the wooden fence. "She was telling me the other day about all the improvements she's making. She's very proud. She even mentioned that you two were going to be co-owners soon, that you were adding her name to the title as a thank you for all her hard work. The air left my lungs in a rush. I gripped the edge of the recycling bin to steady myself. She said what? Mrs. Gable looked uncomfortable, realizing she might have overstepped. Oh dear, I hope I haven't spoken out of turn. It was just an offhand comment. She said that since she'd invested so much from her own house sale into this place, it was only fair. She mentioned something about a verbal agreement you two had. A verbal agreement. The lie was so audacious, so complete, that for a moment I was speechless. My mother wasn't just delusional, she was actively building a false narrative, spreading it to the neighbors to create a history that didn't exist. She was laying the groundwork for her claim, one gossipy fence-side chat at a time. This wasn't just about her wanting to stay, it was about her retroactively justifying her takeover. Mrs. Gable, I said, my voice barely a whisper. That's not true, there is no agreement, my mother is a guest here. The poor woman looked mortified. Oh, Bonnie, I am so sorry, I see. Well, your mother is very persuasive. She trailed off, not wanting to say anything more. But she didn't have to, I understood. My mother, with her librarian's air of authority and her carefully crafted story of the helpful daughter and the investing mother, was painting a picture for the entire neighborhood, a picture in which I was the beneficiary of her generosity, not the victim of her entitlement. I thanked Mrs. Gable for her honesty and retreated into my house, my heart pounding. This was worse than I thought. My mother was not just fighting me inside these walls. She was campaigning against me outside of them, building a case based on lies. Who else had she told this story to? The mailman? The cashier at the grocery store? Was she trying to establish a public record of her investment through sheer force of will? That evening, I did something I hadn't done before. I went into her room while she was out at her weekly bridge game. I knew it was an invasion of privacy, but her conversation with Mrs. Gable had shredded any sense of fair play. I felt like a detective in my own home, searching for clues to understand the mind of my opponent. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had to do something. Her room was a perfect reflection of her, meticulously organized yet suffocating. On her desk, tucked neatly into a folder labeled Household, I found it. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was close. She had receipts from the garden center totaling over $2,000. She had printouts from websites discussing tenancy rights and adverse possession, with certain phrases highlighted in yellow. Phrases like continuous occupation and improvements to the property. But the most chilling discovery was a handwritten note on a legal pad. It was a list of names under the heading Potential Witnesses. Mrs. Gable's name was at the top. Below it were the names of 2 other neighbors and the roofing contractor who had come by weeks ago. She was preparing for a legal battle. She was building a case against me, using my neighbors as unwitting pawns. The sheer premeditation of it all made me sick. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment delusion born of fear of being alone. This was a calculated strategy. She genuinely intended to take me to court to fight for a share of my house. I backed out of the room, closing the door softly, my hands shaking. The whispered warning from Mrs. Gable had been the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface was a cold, calculating plan to usurp my life. My mother, the woman who was supposed to protect me, was actively plotting to seize my most significant asset, the sanctuary I had worked so hard to build. The guilt I had been carrying, the feeling that I was a bad daughter for wanting my mother out, evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She had declared war, and she had already fired the first shots by poisoning the well with the neighbors. The game had changed. This was no longer a family dispute to be solved with a heartfelt conversation. This was a legal matter. She was treating it as such, and it was time I did the same. The whispered warning had been a wake-up call. My mother wasn't just a difficult house guest. She was a hostile occupant, and I needed to start acting accordingly. I picked up my phone, not to call my brother for sympathy, but to search for the best real estate lawyer in the city. The time for being a dutiful daughter was over. It was time to be a homeowner protecting her property. The next Monday morning, I was sitting in the sleek, modern office of Jessica Chen, a real estate lawyer with a reputation for being both brilliant and unshakable. I had found her through a recommendation from a colleague, and from the moment she walked into the conference room, I knew I'd made the right choice. She was in her mid-40s, with a sharp, intelligent gaze and an air of calm confidence that immediately put me at ease. I laid out the whole story, from the temporary favor to the conversation with Mrs. Gable and the chilling discovery of my mother's witness list. I handed her copies of the receipts I had found, the initial email outlining the 3-month agreement, and a timeline of events I had painstakingly compiled the night before. As a data analyst, organizing information into a coherent narrative was my specialty. For the first time, I felt like my professional skills might actually help me in my personal life. Jessica listened intently, her face impassive. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she steepled her fingers and looked at me across the polished mahogany table. "Well, Bonnie," she begged, and her voice even. "On the one hand, your mother's claim is, from a legal standpoint, utterly baseless. On the other hand, the fact that she believes it makes her unpredictable and potentially litigious. We need to proceed carefully." She explained the legal realities to me in clear, concise terms. "Her sweat equity argument is nonsense," Jessica stated flatly. "A guest cannot perform unsolicited work on a property and then claim an ownership stake. If that were possible, every teenager who ever mowed the lawn could sue their parents for a piece of the house. It doesn't work that way." She also debunked the idea of adverse possession, which my mother had clearly been researching. Adverse possession requires the occupation to be hostile, meaning without the owner's permission. Your mother is in your home because you gave her permission. She is a licensee, or at best, a tenant at will. Her rights are minimal. Hearing the legal jargon, the cold, hard facts of the situation, was immensely reassuring. It was like a splash of cold water after weeks of suffocating in my mother's emotional haze. "However," Jessica continued, leaning forward, "the narrative she's building is a problem. If she were to take you to court, it would be a he-said-she-said situation. She would paint you as the ungrateful daughter trying to make her elderly, widowed mother homeless. It would be messy, public, and emotionally draining, even if you would ultimately win. Our goal is to shut this down before it ever gets to that point." This was the start of the investigation phase, though it felt more like building a defense against an impending attack. Jessica's advice was simple: document everything. "From this moment on, every interaction you have with your mother regarding her tenancy should be in writing," she instructed. "If you have a verbal conversation, send her a follow-up email summarizing what was said. Dear Mom, further to our conversation this morning, I am reiterating that your stay in my home was temporary and you need to find alternative accommodation by date. Create a paper trail that a judge can read. No ambiguity." She also had me install security cameras. "Not inside the house, that could get complicated," she clarified. "But outside. A doorbell camera and one overlooking the driveway and front yard. If she accuses you of anything, locking her out, throwing her things away, you will have a clear, time-stamped record of who is coming and going. It's about protecting yourself from false allegations." Following her advice, I began my quiet, methodical work. I went back through my bank statements and highlighted the utility bills, showing the modest increase after she moved in and the few small e-transfers she had sent, all clearly labeled utilities contribution. There was no mention of rent, ever. I also reached out to my brother, Mark, and asked him to write down his recollection of the original dinner where my mother had asked to stay with me. He was happy to help. His statement was clear. Everyone at that table, including our mother, understood that the arrangement was for a couple of months at most. He had been a witness to the original terms. The most difficult part was the emotional detachment I had to adopt. I stopped engaging in arguments with her. When she would bring up the garden or the house, I would simply say, "Mom, we've already discussed this. This is my home and you need to prepare to leave." Then I would walk away. I documented each of these interactions in a private journal, noting the date, time, and what was said. While gathering all this evidence, I started connecting dots I hadn't seen before. I remembered conversations from years ago, my mother joking about how, in the old days, children would take care of their parents in their old age, all living under one roof. I recalled her subtle digs at my independence, her comments that a single woman shouldn't live in a 3-bedroom house all by herself. Such a waste of space. I realized this wasn't a new idea for her. Her plan to move in with me wasn't a desperate, last-minute decision. It was a long-term goal. The quick sale of her house was just the pretext she needed to put her plan into motion. She saw me not as her independent adult daughter, but as her retirement plan. My house wasn't just a convenient stopgap, it was her intended final destination. The garden wasn't just a hobby, it was a strategic move, a tangible investment she could point to. The stories to the neighbors weren't just gossip, they were calculated attempts to create a public perception that supported her narrative. Every action she had taken since moving in was a piece of a larger, deliberate puzzle. This realization was profoundly painful. It was one thing to be at odds with a difficult parent. It was another thing entirely to understand that she had been methodically planning to take advantage of my generosity for years. The love I thought was motivati. NG my actions, the love and duty of a daughter, was simply a tool she was using to get what she wanted. Armed with this new, devastating clarity and a growing folder of evidence, I felt a shift inside me. The fear and confusion were replaced with a cold, clear-eyed determination. Jessica Chen was right. The goal was to shut this down. My mother had built her case on a foundation of emotional manipulation and lies. I would build mine on a foundation of indisputable facts. The data analyst in me was finally in control. I had connected the dots, and the picture they formed was ugly but clear. Now, it was time to create a plan. With my file of evidence growing thicker by the day, I had my second meeting with Jessica Chen. We now had Mark's written statement, my documented timeline of events, financial records, and even a few saved voicemails from my mother, where she complained about the nerve of some landlords asking for a full year's rent up front, implicitly acknowledging her search for another place. Jessica reviewed everything with a meticulous eye. "This is excellent, Bonnie," she said, tapping the folder. "You've established a clear record that she is a guest, not a tenant in the traditional sense, and certainly not a co-owner. Now we move from defense to offense. We need to formalize her eviction." The word eviction still felt harsh, like something that happened to strangers, not your own mother. But Jessica framed it differently. "This is not an act of aggression," she explained calmly. "This is a legal process designed to protect your rights as a property owner. Your mother has left you no choice by refusing to leave voluntarily and by making threats of legal action. We are simply responding with the correct legal instrument. Think of it as a blueprint for getting your life back." The blueprint she laid out was methodical and designed to be unassailable. Step 1 was the formal notice to quit. This was a legal document that would officially terminate her right to occupy the property. In our state, because there was no formal lease and no rent was paid, she was considered a tenant at will. The law required us to give her 30 days' notice. "The notice needs to be delivered properly," Jessica stressed. "We can't just leave it on the kitchen counter. We will hire a professional process server. It's an official, neutral third party. Your mother will be handed the papers, and the server will sign an affidavit of service. She cannot claim she never received it." Step 2 was preparing for her reaction. "She is going to be furious, Bonnie. She will likely escalate, either by refusing to leave or by trying to make good on her threat to sue you. We need to be ready." This meant preparing a holdover petition in advance. If she wasn't out of the house by the deadline specified in the notice, we would file the petition with the court the very next day. This would initiate a formal eviction proceeding. "But what about her claims? The garden, the witnesses?" I asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. "We address them head-on," Jessica said, her confidence unwavering. "We will attach a sworn affidavit from you to the petition. In it, you will outline the original agreement, her status as a guest, and the fact that any improvements she made were unsolicited, unwanted, and done against your express wishes. We will also attach Mark's statement as a supporting document. We present our entire case up front, showing the judge that her claims are baseless and that this is a simple matter of a licensee who has overstayed her welcome. The blueprint was incredibly detailed. Jessica even coached me on what to do and say after the notice was served. Do not engage in arguments. If she yells, you walk away. If she threatens you, you record it if you can do so legally in your state. If she refuses to speak to you, fine. Let all communication go through me. Your home will be a tense environment for the next 30 days, but you must remain calm and detached. You are no longer her daughter in this matter. You are her landlord. Leaving her office that day, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. The situation was still awful, but now it was a problem with a structured, logical solution. It was a project plan. There were steps, deadlines, and deliverables. It was a language I understood. The following week, I put the plan into motion. I signed the notice to quit in Jessica's office, and she arranged for the process server. I went home that evening feeling like a coiled spring. I knew the server was scheduled to arrive the next day between 4 and 6 p.m. I spent the day working from home, my stomach in knots. I tried to act normal, making small talk with my mother about the weather, all the while knowing that a legal time bomb was about to detonate in our living room. At 4:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. My mother, who was watching a game show on her ridiculously large television, looked over at me. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked. "No," I lied, my heart hammering against my ribs. She got up and opened the door. A man in a plain polo shirt stood on the porch. "Are you a leaner?" he asked politely. "Yes," she said, a flicker of suspicion on her face. "This is for you," he said, handing her a large manila envelope. She took it, looking confused. As she turned it over in her hands, he said, "You've been served," turned on his heel, and walked back down the path. The silence in the house was absolute. My mother tore open the envelope and pulled out the legal document. I watched as her eyes scanned the formal, intimidating text. I could see the exact moment she understood what it was. Her face, which had been set in its usual expression of pleasant entitlement, contorted into a mask of pure fury. Her head snapped up, and she stared at me, her eyes blazing with a rage I had never seen before. "You're evicting me," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief and anger. "You are throwing your own mother out onto the street." This was the moment Jessica had warned me about, the explosion. I took a deep breath, stood up, and looked her directly in the eye. "I am formally asking you to leave my property," I said, my voice shaking only slightly. "You have 30 days, as required by law. I suggest you use that time to find a new place to live. If you have any questions, you can direct them to my lawyer. Her card is in the envelope." I didn't wait for her response. I turned and walked to my bedroom, closing the door behind me and locking it. I could hear her screaming my name from the living room, a string of insults and accusations echoing through the house. She called me ungrateful, heartless, a monster. She vowed to see me in court. She swore she would own this house. I sat on my bed, listening to her rampage, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel guilt or fear. I just felt a profound, aching sadness. The legal blueprint was working, but the emotional cost was immense. I had just served an eviction notice to my own mother. There was no going back from this. The bridge between us wasn't just burned, it had been utterly demolished, and I was the one who had lit the match. The 30 days following the serving of the eviction notice were the longest and most toxic of my life. The house became a pressure cooker of resentment. My mother, Alina, swung wildly between two tactics, the silent treatment and open warfare. Some days, she would glide through the house like a ghost, refusing to acknowledge my existence, communicating only through passive-aggressive notes left on the counter. "Leftover chicken in fridge. Eat it so it doesn't go to waste," one would read, the subtext being, "You are a wasteful, ungrateful child." Other days were filled with open hostility. She would call her friends and my relatives, weeping dramatically into the phone about her homelessness and my cruelty, making sure I was within earshot. I received a barrage of angry texts and calls from aunts and cousins who had only heard her side of the story. I was painted as a villain, a cold-hearted daughter who would rather see her mother on the street than share her big, empty house. Each message felt like a small cut, but I held firm to Jessica's advice. I did not engage. I forwarded the most egregious messages to my lawyer and blocked the numbers. My only ally in the family was my brother Mark, who ran interference for me, patiently explaining the reality of the situation to anyone who would listen. Elinor made a great show of packing, but it was all for performance. She would drag a box into the living room, sigh heavily as she placed a single porcelain thimble inside, and then leave the box there for days, a monument to her supposed efforts. Her goal was clear: to make me feel so guilty that I would back down. But I had my legal blueprint, and I clung to it like a life raft. Every interaction, every note, every hostile outburst was documented. The outdoor security cameras I'd installed captured her comings and goings, providing a quiet, factual record that contradicted the frantic narrative she was spinning to others. The real confrontation came a week before the deadline. I came home from work to find her sitting at the dining room table with a smug look on her face. Next to her was an official-looking letter. "I've spoken to a lawyer," she announced, her voice dripping with triumph. "From the Senior Legal Aid Society. He says I have an excellent case. He's filing a response to your ridiculous notice." My heart sank a little, but I kept my expression neutral. "Okay, Mom." "He says my investments in the property, my residency, and our verbal agreements give me a strong claim," she continued, clearly enjoying herself. "He's going to countersue for a portion of the property's value. So you see, Bonnie, you're not getting rid of me. You might end up paying me." I simply nodded. "If you have a lawyer and he can speak to my lawyer." I turned to walk away, but she wasn't done. "I will not be leaving on the 30th, she declared. "We will see you in court." This was the moment of truth. She was calling my bluff. That evening, I called Jessica and told her what happened. "Good," Jessica said, surprisingly. "Now we know her strategy. She's going to fight it. We'll be ready. The holdover petition is prepared. We file it the morning after she fails to vacate." The deadline day arrived. It was a Tuesday. I woke up with a feeling of dread. I went through my morning routine in silence. Elinor was still there, pointedly watering her precious roses in the front yard when I left for work, giving me a defiant glare. I spent the day in a fog, unable to concentrate, just watching the clock. I came home that evening to find her exactly where she'd been in the morning, sitting on the porch swing as if she owned the place. Her bags were not packed. No moving truck was in sight. She had not left. "The deadline was 5 o'clock, I said, standing at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm not going anywhere," she said calmly, not even looking at me. I didn't argue, I didn't yell. I just pulled out my phone and sent a one-word text to Jessica Chen: "Ready." The next morning, Jessica filed the holdover petition with the local housing court. A court date was set for 2 weeks later. When the official notice from the court arrived for my mother, her smug confidence finally began to crack. This was no longer a theoretical threat. There was a date, a time, a courtroom. This was real. The day in court was surreal. I sat next to Jessica at one table, and my mother sat with her legal aid lawyer at the other. She looked smaller, less formidable, under the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. Her lawyer, a young, earnest man who looked overwhelmed, began by presenting her case. He talked about the garden, the money she'd spent, her age, her status as a widow. He tried to paint a picture of a vulnerable senior being taken advantage of by a cold daughter. Then it was Jessica's turn. She was a master. Calmly, methodically, she dismantled their entire argument. She presented the initial email outlining the 3-month stay. She presented my bank statements showing there was no rent paid. She presented Mark's sworn statement about the original agreement. When the opposing lawyer brought up the garden, Jessica was ready. "Your Honor, My client repeatedly asked her mother to stop altering the landscaping. Any money spent was done against the homeowner's wishes. A guest cannot force unwanted improvements on a property and then demand payment or ownership. That's not equity, that's vandalism. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, looked over the documents. She turned to my mother's lawyer. "Counselor, does your client have a lease?" "No, Your Honor, but..." "Does she have any written agreement granting her tenancy beyond the initial 3 months?" "No, Your Honor, but there were verbal understandings." The judge cut him off. "Does your client have any proof of ownership? Is her name on the deed or the mortgage?" "No, Your Honor." The judge sighed, looking at my mother with a mixture of impatience and pity. "Ma'am," she said, speaking directly to Elinor, "I appreciate that you love the garden, but planting flowers does not make you the owner of a house. You are a guest in your daughter's home, a licensee. That license has been revoked. You have been given proper notice. You have no legal right to remain on the property." My mother's face crumpled. The fight went out of her in an instant. She looked shocked, as if she truly believed her fantasy would hold up in a court of law. The judge issued the ruling. A warrant of eviction would be granted. My mother was given a final, non-negotiable deadline. She had 72 hours to vacate the premises. If she failed to do so, the sheriff would come to remove her. We walked out of the courtroom in silence. My mother wouldn't look at me. Her lawyer was trying to speak to her, but she just shook her head. The confrontation was over. There were no more arguments to be had, no more threats to be made. The law had spoken. I had won. But standing there on the courthouse steps, watching my mother look so utterly defeated, I felt no sense of victory. I just felt empty. The 72 hours the judge granted my mother were the quietest the house had been in months. The fight was over, the legal battle won, and all that was left was the hollow echo of the verdict. Elinor finally seemed to understand that there were no more appeals, no more arguments she could make. The delusion had shattered against the hard wall of reality. She called my brother, Mark, and he came over the next day with a U-Haul trailer attached to his truck. I stayed in my office with the door closed while they worked, listening to the sounds of boxes being taped up, furniture scraping against the floor, and the low murmur of their conversation. I couldn't bring myself to watch. Each sound was a painful reminder of how broken our family had become. This wasn't a triumphant reclaiming of my space. It was a sad, necessary amputation. Mark found a last-minute, furnished apartment for her to rent, a small one-bedroom in a decent complex across town. He paid the deposit and the first month's rent out of his own savings to make sure she had a place to land. He was the hero of the situation, the one who managed to show compassion even in the face of our mother's destructive behavior. Late that afternoon, Mark knocked on my office door. "She's ready to go," he said quietly. I took a deep breath and walked out into the living room. It was startlingly empty. Her heavy furniture was gone, the oppressive landscape painting was off the wall, and the space already felt lighter, bigger. My house was starting to look like my own again. Elinor was standing by the front door, her purse in her hand. She wouldn't look at me. Her face was pale and drawn. The fury was gone, replaced by a brittle, wounded pride. "The keys are on the counter," she said, her voice flat. It was the first thing she'd said to me since the court hearing. "Okay," I replied softly. There was nothing else to say. "I'm sorry it came to this," felt like a lie. "I hope you'll be okay," felt condescending. So I just stood there, a stranger in the hallway with the woman who had raised me. She walked out the door without another word, got into Mark's car, and they drove away. I watched until the car turned the corner, and then I closed the door. The lock clicking into place sounded unnaturally loud in the silent house. And then I cried. I sank down onto the floor and wept for everything that had been lost. I cried for the mother I wished I had, for the relationship we could never build, and for the ugly, necessary battle I had just survived. The days that followed were about reclaiming my life, piece by piece. The first thing I did was hire a landscaping company. I had them rip out every single one of her prize-winning roses, every perfectly aligned petunia, every manicured hedge. I had them till the soil and help me replant the native wildflowers and grasses she had destroyed. As I worked in the dirt, putting my own garden back together, I felt a sense of healing. I was literally and figuratively replanting my roots in my own soil. I moved my own furniture back into place. I rehung my art on the walls. I deep-cleaned every room, scrubbing away the last lingering scent of her perfume, erasing the psychic residue of her occupation. With each small act, the house felt more and more like my sanctuary again. The relationship with my mother is, for all intents and purposes, over. She refuses to speak to me. Mark sees her occasionally, making sure she's paying her bills and taking care of herself. He tells me she spends most of her time complaining about her tiny apartment and the injustice of it all. She has learned nothing. In her story, she will always be the victim. I've had to accept that. I've had to accept that I can't change her, and I can't fix our relationship. All I could do was protect myself. The eviction was not just about getting my house back. It was about drawing a final, unbreakable boundary. It was a declaration that I would no longer allow her entitlement to destroy my peace. It's been 6 months now. My house is quiet. My garden is growing back, beautifully wild and free. My life is orderly and calm. Sometimes a wave of sadness hits me when I think about how things ended. The scars of that battle are still there, but then I look around at the home I fought for, the peace I reclaimed, and I know I made the right decision. I chose myself. I chose my sanity. And while I may have lost a mother, I finally, truly got my home back.